The morning sun was just starting to rise over Pine Street as Harold Mitchell slowly got ready for his day. At 93 years old, he took pride in maintaining his daily routine, even though it took him longer than it used to. His wrinkled hands carefully buttoned up his favorite blue plaid shirt, the same one his late wife Mary had given him 5 years ago before she passed away. Harold lived alone in his small but neat white house, the same one he had bought after returning from World War II. The walls were covered with old photographs, some in black and white, showing the younger Harold in his military uniform, while others displayed happier times with Mary and their children, who now lived in different states with their own families. Every morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., Harold would begin his slow walk to Joe's Diner, just 3 blocks away from his house. He always carried his old wooden cane, not because he couldn't walk without it, but because Mary had insisted he use it after his hip surgery 10 years ago. Now it felt like carrying a piece of her with him everywhere he went. The walk to Joe's Diner was Harold's favorite part of the day. He would stop to say hello to Mrs. Thompson, who was always watering her roses, and wave to young Tommy, the paper boy who reminded him of himself when he was young. The familiar faces and friendly greetings made him feel connected to his community, something that became even more important after Mary's passing. Joe's Diner had been Harold's breakfast spot for the past 30 years. The bell above the door would ring as he pushed it open, and the smell of fresh coffee and bacon would instantly greet him. Sarah, the waitress who had worked there for 15 years, would always call out, "Morning, Mr. Mitchell. Your usual corner booth is waiting for you." His corner booth was special. It had a view of both the street and the entire diner, a habit he had kept from his military days when he always needed to be aware of his surroundings. The red leather seats were worn but comfortable, and the table had small scratches that told stories of countless meals and conversations. Every morning, Harold would order the same thing: 2 eggs over easy, crispy bacon, wheat toast with butter, and a cup of black coffee. Sarah didn't even need to take his order anymore. She would just smile and say, "Coming right up, Mr. Mitchell." While waiting for his breakfast, Harold would solve the daily crossword puzzle from the local newspaper using the same blue pen he kept in his shirt pocket. The other regular customers at Joe's Diner treated Harold with respect. They knew bits and pieces of his story: how he had served in the Pacific during World War II, how he had worked at the local post office for 35 years after returning home, and how devoted he had been to Mary during their 65 years of marriage. Young parents would often tell their children, "That's Mr. Mitchell. He's a real hero who fought for our country." On this particular morning, Harold sat in his usual booth, sipping his coffee and working on the crossword puzzle. The diner was filled with its usual morning sounds: the sizzle of bacon on the grill, the clinking of coffee cups, and the quiet conversations of other customers. Everything felt normal and peaceful, just the way Harold liked it. What Harold didn't know was that this ordinary morning would soon turn into something very different. As he focused on his crossword puzzle, trying to figure out a 7-letter word for courage, the rumble of motorcycle engines grew louder outside Joe's Diner. The peaceful routine he had maintained for so many years was about to face an unexpected challenge. Sarah brought his breakfast just as she always did, but there was a slight worry in her eyes as she glanced at the parking lot. Harold was too absorbed in his crossword puzzle to notice the growing shadows of leather-clad figures approaching the diner's entrance. The bell above the door rang again, but this time it wasn't the friendly sound Harold was used to hearing. The bell above Joe's Diner door chimed aggressively as 5 large men in black leather jackets walked in. Their heavy boots made loud thuds against the checkered floor, and the peaceful morning atmosphere instantly changed. The leader, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his neck, looked around the diner with cold eyes. His jacket had a patch that read "Snake" across the back. The regular customers at Joe's Diner fell silent. Sarah, the waitress, stopped mid-step with a coffee pot in her hand, watching as the bikers made their way straight toward Harold's corner booth. The sound of their chains jingling with each step echoed through the quiet diner. Snake stopped right in front of Harold's table, casting a dark shadow over the veteran's crossword puzzle. Harold looked up slowly, his weathered hand still holding his blue pen. The other 4 bikers spread out behind their leader, crossing their arms and grinning. "Hey, old-timer," Snake said loudly, his voice rough like gravel. "You're in our spot." He pointed at the booth with a gloved finger, ignoring the fact that there were plenty of empty seats available in the diner. Harold carefully folded his newspaper and placed it beside his half-eaten breakfast. I've been sitting in this booth every morning for 30 years, young man, he said calmly, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. There are many other comfortable seats available. Snake leaned forward, placing both hands on Harold's table. His silver rings made a threatening sound as they hit the surface. Well, times change, Grandpa, and now this is our spot. The other bikers laughed, their voices too loud for the small diner. Sarah stepped forward, still holding the coffee pot. Now listen here, she started, but Snake's sharp look made her stop mid-sentence. Joe, the diner's owner, watched nervously from behind the counter, his hand hovering near the phone. Harold looked around the diner, seeing the worried faces of people he had known for years. Mrs. Anderson, who always sat by the window with her romance novels, clutched her book tightly. The young couple who had just moved to town last month tried to make themselves invisible in their booth. I don't want any trouble, Harold said quietly, reaching for his wooden cane. As he started to stand up, Snake deliberately bumped the table, causing Harold's coffee to spill across his crossword puzzle and onto his plaid shirt. Oops, Snake said with a cruel smile. Guess you should be more careful, old man. His gang laughed again, the sound echoing off the diner's walls. Harold looked down at his stained shirt, Mary's last gift to him. His hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. It was taking all of his military discipline not to react to these bullies. He had faced much worse in the Pacific during the war. The bikers slid into his booth before Harold could even grab his cane properly. Snake stretched out in the seat, putting his dirty boots up on the table where Harold's breakfast had been just moments before. Thanks for keeping our spot warm, he said, making a shooing motion with his hand. Sarah rushed over with a clean towel for Harold, her eyes filled with anger and concern. Mr. Mitchell, I'm so sorry, she whispered, trying to help him clean his shirt. The other customers watched in uncomfortable silence as Harold slowly made his way to the counter, leaning heavily on his cane. Put his breakfast on our tab, Snake called out mockingly. It's the least we can do for the elderly. More laughter erupted from the group as they started ordering their own breakfast loudly, acting as if they owned the place. Joe brought Harold a fresh cup of coffee at the counter, refusing to charge him. Maybe try coming a little later tomorrow, Mr. Mitchell, he suggested quietly, worried about his oldest customer's safety. Harold took a sip of his coffee, his blue eyes studying the bikers in his booth. They were wearing patches that claimed they were veterans, but something about them didn't seem right to his experienced eye. After decades in the military, he could spot fake soldiers from a mile away. As he finished his coffee, Harold made a mental note of each biker's patches and symbols. His mind, still sharp despite his age, was already forming a plan. These young men had no idea who they were dealing with, and Harold decided it was time they learned a lesson about respecting their elders. Harold didn't return to Joe's diner the next day, but not because he was afraid. Instead, he spent the morning in his study, a small room that few people had ever seen. The walls were covered with medals, certificates, and old maps from his military service. A large wooden desk sat in the corner, its surface neat and organized, just as he had kept it during his years as a communications officer. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk with a small brass key that he kept on his bedside table. Inside were carefully preserved documents from his time in the Pacific. Papers that told the story of a much younger Harold Mitchell, one who had helped coordinate some of the most important operations of World War II. But it wasn't the medals or documents that Harold was looking for. His hands reached for an old leather address book, its pages yellow with age, but still perfectly maintained. Inside were phone numbers and contacts that he had gathered over 50 years, generals who were now in high positions, intelligence officers who owed him favors, and military police commanders who had never forgotten his service. As Harold flipped through the pages, his mind went back to the previous day at the diner. The bikers' patches had caught his attention. They claimed to be from the Desert Storm Veterans Association, but Harold knew something was wrong. The dates didn't match up with the ages of the men, and some of the military insignias they wore were in the wrong order, mistakes no real veteran would make. He picked up his old rotary phone, the one he refused to replace despite his children's protests. His fingers, though wrinkled with age, dialed a number he hadn't called in years. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. General Morrison's office, a young secretary said. "This is Communications Officer Harold Mitchell," he said clearly. Service number 47,829. I need to speak with James. Harold smiled slightly, remembering how young Lieutenant James Morrison had once saved his life during a midnight communications run. There was a pause, then shuffling papers. "One moment, sir," the secretary said, her voice now more respectful after checking his credentials. While waiting, Harold opened a small notebook and wrote down everything he had observed about the bikers, their patches, their bikes' license plates that he had carefully memorized, and the names they had called each other. His training had taught him that details were everything. "Harold, is that really you?" General Morrison's voice boomed through the phone. "It's been what? 5 years since Mary's funeral." "Hello, James," Harold said warmly. "I wish I was calling just to catch up, but I need your help with something." He explained about the bikers, their fake veteran claims, and their behavior at the diner. As he spoke, his voice became stronger, more like the officer he had once been. General Morrison listened quietly, only interrupting once to ask about the specific patches and insignias Harold had noticed. When Harold finished, there was a long pause. "They're using fake military credentials?" The general's voice had turned cold. "And harassing a decorated World War II veteran? In my jurisdiction?" He took a deep breath. "Harold, remember that time in Guadalcanal when you coordinated that midnight evacuation? Saved my whole unit." "That was a long time ago, James," Harold said modestly. "Well, it's time I returned the favor," the general replied. "Those men aren't just disrespecting you, they're committing a federal offense. Stolen valor is a serious crime." They talked for another 10 minutes, making plans. By the time Harold hung up the phone, a small smile played on his lips. He looked at the old photograph on his desk, showing him in his uniform standing next to his communications equipment. He had been different then, younger, stronger, but the strategic mind that had saved so many lives during the war was still sharp. Harold picked up his cane and stood up slowly. Tomorrow, he would return to Joe's diner for breakfast, just like always, but this time, things would be very different. The bikers were about to learn that appearances could be deceiving, and that some old veterans had more power than they appeared to have. The next morning arrived with dark clouds hanging over the town. Harold woke up earlier than usual, his military habits kicking in before his alarm clock could ring. He got dressed carefully, choosing his old brown leather jacket that still had his real military patches sewn on the inside. He hadn't worn it in years, but today felt right. At exactly 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than his usual time, Harold started his walk to Joe's diner. The streets were quiet, with only a few cars passing by. Mrs. Thompson wasn't out watering her roses yet, and even Tommy the paperboy hadn't started his route. The air felt heavy with the promise of rain. As Harold approached the diner, he noticed 5 motorcycles already parked outside, their chrome surfaces dull under the gray sky. Snake and his gang had arrived early too, probably thinking they would catch him off guard again. Harold gripped his cane a little tighter, but kept walking at his steady pace. The bell above the door rang softly as he entered. Inside, the bikers were sprawled across several booths, including his usual corner spot. They looked up as he walked in, and Snake's face split into a cruel grin. "Well, look who's brave enough to come back," Snake called out, standing up slowly. His leather jacket creaked as he moved, the fake military patches catching the diner's fluorescent lights. The other bikers turned to watch, their breakfast plates forgotten. Sarah stood behind the counter, nervously wiping the same spot over and over. Joe was nowhere to be seen, probably in the kitchen calling the police again, though they hadn't helped much the last few times. Harold walked straight toward his usual booth, his cane tapping steadily against the floor. He stopped a few feet from Snake, looking directly into the younger man's eyes. "I'd like my booth back," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the quiet diner. Snake stepped closer, towering over Harold. "You didn't learn your lesson yesterday, old man." He reached out and knocked Harold's cane aside, making the old veteran stumble slightly. The other bikers laughed, but their laughter died quickly when Harold straightened up. There was something different about him today, a glint in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You know," Harold said quietly, still looking directly at Snake, "I've been studying your patches. The dates don't match up. And that unit insignia you're wearing, it's upside down." He took a small step forward, his voice growing stronger. "Real veterans don't make mistakes like that." Snake's face turned red. "What did you say?" he growled, reaching for Harold's jacket. Just then, the diner's door burst open. The bell didn't just ring. It nearly flew off as 4 military police officers in full uniform stormed in. Behind them came General Morrison himself, his stars gleaming on his shoulders, followed by 2 more MPs. The bikers froze. Snake's hand dropped from Harold's jacket as if it had burned him. The other gang members looked around frantically, but the MPs were already blocking both exits. "Gentlemen," General Morrison said, his voice cold as steel, "I believe you're wearing military decorations you haven't earned. That's a federal offense." He walked over to Harold, standing beside his old friend. "And you've been harassing a decorated World War II veteran, a man who saved my life and the lives of countless others." The MPs moved in, their faces stern. One of them picked up Harold's cane and respectfully handed it back to him. Snake and his gang were too shocked to resist as the officers began checking their IDs and taking photos of their fake military patches as evidence. Harold finally sat down in his usual booth, watching as the bikers were lined up against the wall. Sarah hurried over with his regular order: 2 eggs over easy, crispy bacon, wheat toast, and black coffee. As he unfolded his morning newspaper, Harold could hear Snake stammering excuses to the MPs. The general sat down across from him, just like in the old days. Outside, the dark clouds were starting to clear. An ray of sunlight streamed through the diner's windows. The next hour at Joe's Diner turned into something no one had expected. As the military police checked each biker's identification, General Morrison sat with Harold, sharing stories about their time in service. The regular customers watched in amazement as they learned more about their quiet neighbor than they had known in all these years. "Remember that night in the Philippines?" General Morrison asked, his coffee growing cold as he talked. "When you managed to intercept that coded message just in time." His voice was full of respect as he looked at his old friend. Harold nodded modestly, taking a sip of his coffee. "Just doing my job, James. Like anyone else would have." The other customers in the diner had moved closer to listen, forming a respectful circle around the booth. Meanwhile, the MPs were discovering more than just fake military credentials. Snake and his gang had backpacks full of stolen wallets and jewelry. One of the officers found a notebook with addresses of other diners they had terrorized across 3 states. Sarah brought over fresh coffee and a plate of her special blueberry muffins, refusing to let either Harold or the general pay. "On the house," she said firmly, wiping away happy tears. "I've waited 2 years to see someone stand up to those bullies." Joe came out from the kitchen, carrying an old frame. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 1946, showing a much younger Harold in his uniform. "Found this in my father's old things," he said, placing it on the table. "Dad always said you were a hero, Mr. Mitchell, but you never wanted to talk about it." The military police finished their work, leading Snake and his gang outside in handcuffs. The fake veterans had gone from tough guys to scared boys in less than an hour. Their motorcycles were being loaded onto police trucks as evidence. One of the younger MPs approached Harold's booth and stood at attention. "Sir," he said formally, "we found something interesting. These men are wanted in connection with several robberies targeting elderly veterans. They've been using fake military credentials to gain trust before stealing from them." General Morrison's face darkened with anger, but Harold remained calm. He looked out the window at the bikers being placed in police cars. "Sometimes the loudest ones have the most to hide," he said quietly. The story spread quickly through the small town. By lunchtime, the local newspaper reporter was at the diner, taking photos and interviewing witnesses. Harold tried to avoid the attention, but General Morrison made sure everyone knew about his friend's heroic past. "Harold Mitchell isn't just any veteran," the general told the reporter. "He was one of our most valuable communications officers. His work saved thousands of lives, though he'll never brag about it." He went on to describe how Harold had broken enemy codes and coordinated crucial operations during the war. Mrs. Thompson, who had come to the diner after hearing the news, remembered something. "That explains why you always chose that corner booth," she said. "Perfect view of all entrances and exits. Once a soldier, always a soldier." As the excitement began to die down, Harold finally finished his breakfast, now cold, but he didn't mind. The diner had become crowded with people wanting to shake his hand and thank him, not just for today but for his service all those years ago. General Morrison had to leave, But before he did, he placed a hand on Harold's shoulder. "Next time someone gives you trouble, don't wait so long to call me," he said with a smile, "though I have a feeling no one will be bothering you anymore." Harold watched his old friend leave, then looked around at the diner that had been his morning home for so many years. Everything was the same: the checkered floor, the smell of coffee, the sound of plates clinking in the kitchen. But something had changed. The respect had always been there, but now people understood why. By the next morning, Harold's story had spread far beyond their small town. News vans with tall antennas parked outside Joe's diner, and reporters in neat suits waited hopefully for Harold to arrive for his usual breakfast. But Harold didn't show up at his regular time. Instead, he sat in his living room, looking through an old photo album while his phone kept ringing. His daughter Linda had called 3 times already, having seen him on the morning news. His son Robert had sent several text messages, which Harold was still learning how to read on the new phone his grandchildren had given him. At 9:30 a.m., a gentle knock on his front door made Harold look up. Through the window, he could see Sarah from the diner standing on his porch, holding a paper bag that smelled like his usual breakfast order. He smiled and walked over to let her in. "The reporters are driving Joe crazy," Sarah said, placing the bag on Harold's kitchen table. "But I figured you still needed your breakfast." She looked around the small house, noticing for the first time all the military photographs and medals that Harold had never mentioned. "Thank you, Sarah," Harold said warmly. "Would you like some coffee? I think I need someone to talk to who isn't holding a microphone." They both chuckled as he put on a pot of coffee. While they sat at his kitchen table, Sarah told him how the story had grown. The police had discovered that Snake and his gang had been running their scam across multiple states, targeting not just diners but also veterans' homes and military surplus stores. Their arrest had helped solve dozens of open cases. "The real veterans are calling you a hero," Sarah said, sipping her coffee. "Joe's put up that old newspaper clipping of you in a new frame by the register. And you should see all the old soldiers who came to the diner this morning, just hoping to meet you." Harold shook his head modestly. "I'm no hero," he said quietly. "I just did what was right. Like back in the war, you see something wrong, you try to fix it." As they talked, another knock came at the door. This time it was Tommy, the paper boy, with a stack of newspapers. "Mr. Mitchell," he called out excitedly. "You're on the front page. Can I have your autograph?" Harold opened the door and invited Tommy in. The boy's eyes grew wide as he saw all the military photographs and medals. Sarah helped Harold clear space on the table as Tommy spread out the newspapers. Each one had a different headline. "World War II veteran outsmarts criminal biker gang. 93-year-old hero helps crack multi-state crime ring. Local veteran proves age is just a number." While they looked through the papers, more visitors started arriving. Mrs. Thompson brought her famous apple pie. Joe came by with more coffee and pastries from the diner. Even the mayor stopped in briefly, wanting to discuss plans for a ceremony to honor Harold's service, both past and present. Harold's small house slowly filled with neighbors and friends, many of whom were learning his story for the first time. They listened intently as he finally opened up about his years in service, showing them old photographs and explaining what each medal meant. "This one," he said, holding up a particularly impressive medal, "was for breaking a difficult code that helped save an entire convoy. But you know what makes me prouder?" He looked around at the friendly faces in his living room. "Being part of this community, having good neighbors who look out for each other." As the morning turned to afternoon, Harold's house became a gathering place for people sharing stories, bringing food, and showing their appreciation. The reporters outside eventually left, realizing that the real story wasn't about the arrest of a criminal gang. It was about a modest hero who had quietly served his country and community for decades. A week after the incident at Joe's diner, Harold sat in the town hall's main room, surrounded by people he had known for years and others he had never met. The mayor had organized a special ceremony to honor him, despite Harold's protests that it wasn't necessary. The room was packed with veterans from different wars, local families, and even a few television cameras. General Morrison stood at the podium, wearing his full-dress uniform with all his medals shining under the lights. "Today," he began, his voice strong and clear, "we're not just honoring Harold Mitchell for his recent bravery. We're celebrating a lifetime of quiet service and dedication." Harold sat in his chair, wearing his old military uniform that his daughter Linda had carefully pressed for the occasion. It still fit. though a bit more snugly than it had in 1945. His son Robert sat on one side, while his grandchildren fidgeted excitedly on the other. What many people don't know, General Morrison continued, is that Harold's actions last week didn't just stop a group of criminals. His careful observation of their fake military credentials helped us uncover a larger network of people who were stealing from veterans across the country. The audience listened as the general explained how the investigation had expanded. The fake bikers had been part of a larger group that had been targeting veteran communities for years. Thanks to Harold's intervention, police had arrested 12 more suspects and recovered stolen medals, photographs, and personal items belonging to real veterans. Sarah and Joe sat in the front row, both dressed in their Sunday best. Joe had closed the diner for the morning, so all the regular customers could attend. Even Tommy the paperboy had skipped his route to be there, wearing a tie for the first time in his life. But perhaps the most important thing Harold taught us, the general said, looking at his old friend, is that true strength isn't about physical power or intimidation. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter your age or circumstances. As if to prove this point, 3 elderly veterans who had been victims of the fake bikers' scheme stood up. They had traveled from different states to thank Harold personally. One of them, a man named Frank who used a wheelchair, rolled forward to present Harold with a special plaque from their Veterans Association. "You got back more than just our stolen items," Frank said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You gave us back our dignity." The mayor stepped up next, announcing that the corner booth at Joe's Diner would officially be named Harold's Corner, with a small plaque to mark it. The announcement brought tears to Sarah's eyes and a round of applause from the crowd. Then came a surprise that even Harold hadn't expected. A group of young military cadets from the nearby base marched in, carrying a large box. Inside was Harold's old communications equipment, carefully restored by military engineers. They had found it in storage and wanted him to have it for a new veterans museum the town was planning to build. As Harold ran his hands over the familiar dials and switches, memories flooded back. He remembered the long nights sending coded messages, the lives that had depended on his quick thinking and steady hands. But more importantly, he thought about how those skills had never really left him. They had just been waiting for the right moment to be used again. The ceremony ended with something that made Harold smile more than all the honors and speeches. The town's children, led by Tommy, had prepared a special presentation about World War II communications officers. They had learned about Morse code and even practiced sending simple messages to each other. "See, Mr. Mitchell," Tommy said proudly, showing him their work. "We're learning to be careful and observant, just like you." As the crowd began to mingle and share refreshments, Harold sat back in his chair, watching the mixture of old and young, military and civilian, all brought together by an unexpected series of events. His quiet morning routine had changed into something much bigger than himself, touching lives he had never known he could reach. 1 month after the ceremony, life in the small town had found a new normal. Harold still walked to Joe's Diner every morning at 7:30 a.m., but things were different now. The small brass plaque on his corner booth gleamed in the morning sun, reading Harold's Corner, in honor of true service and courage. This particular morning was special. Harold sat in his booth, not alone as he used to, but surrounded by 4 other veterans who now made it their routine to join him for breakfast. They ranged in age from 65 to 88, each with their own stories from different wars, but all looking up to Harold with respect. Sarah didn't even need to take their orders anymore. She brought their usual breakfasts and called them her Veterans Club. The men would solve crossword puzzles together, share stories, and sometimes just sit in comfortable silence, understanding each other in a way that only soldiers could. The diner itself had changed too. The walls now featured a carefully arranged display of military photographs, including the famous newspaper clipping of young Harold. Joe had also added a small museum corner, showing Harold's restored communications equipment and information about World War II code breaking. Every Wednesday morning, with the town council's approval, local school children would visit the diner as part of their history lessons. Harold and his veteran friends would teach them about different aspects of military service. Today, it was a group of 5th graders sitting at nearby tables, listening with wide eyes as Harold explained how he used to send coded messages. Sometimes, Harold told them, demonstrating with his old equipment, the smallest details could make the biggest difference. The children nodded, remembering how Harold's attention to detail had helped catch the fake bikers. Tommy, who had become like a grandson to Harold, now did more than just deliver newspapers. He had started a junior veterans appreciation club at his school, and every morning you would stop by Harold's house to walk with him to the diner, listening to stories along the way. The story of the Fate bikers had reached far beyond their small town. The investigation had led to more arrests, and Harold's example had inspired other communities to start veteran support programs. His phone still rang occasionally with journalists wanting interviews, but he politely declined most of them, preferring his quiet morning routine with his new friends. General Morrison visited regularly, no longer in his formal uniform, but dressed casually like any other customer. He and Harold would reminisce about old times, but more importantly, they would talk about the future, about programs to protect elderly veterans and ways to help younger soldiers adjust to civilian life. On this particular morning, as Harold finished his breakfast and the school children prepared to leave, a young man in a military uniform entered the diner. He stood at attention near Harold's booth and introduced himself as the grandson of one of the veterans whose stolen medals had been recovered thanks to Harold's actions. "Sir," the young soldier said, "I just completed my training as a communications officer. My grandfather told me your story, and I wanted to thank you personally. You've shown us that a soldier's duty to protect others never really ends." Harold smiled and invited the young man to join them. As they talked, Harold looked around the diner, at the children learning about history, at his fellow veterans sharing stories, at Sarah serving coffee with a proud smile, at Tommy taking notes for his club meeting. His quiet corner of the world had become something more, a place where the past connected with the present, where stories were shared and remembered, where service was honored not just with plaques and ceremonies, but with daily acts of respect and friendship. As the morning sun streamed through the windows, Harold picked up his coffee cup and smiled. His routine morning walk to breakfast had sparked a change that would continue long after he was gone, teaching new generations about courage, honor, and the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter your age.